You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers, and we believe in the power of books to help shape informed investors. In this podcast, we speak to great authors about their writing. The late, great Charlie Munger prescribed using multiple mental models and analysis. We analyze their work through the lens of business, markets, and people. We will look back today at the history to ask, how did we get to where we are at, and is there a lot of reason for our present state? Joining us to talk about his recently published book, Who Owns This Sentence? A History of Copyrights and Wrongs, is David Bellos, who he co-authored this book with Alexander Montague. A little bit about David. David Bellos is a writer, translator, and the Meredith Howland Pine Professor of French Comparative Literature at Princeton University. His book is That a Fish in Your Ear? Translation and the Meaning of Everything has been translated in many languages, including Japanese and Farsi. He has won the IBM French Translation Prize and the Goncourt Prize for Biography. I assume you're joining me from Princeton today. Is that fair, David?
Yes, I'm speaking from Princeton's broadcasting studio, yes.
Nice. Well, we've had quite a run of Princeton folks, including Harold James here more recently. His book, Seven Crashes. So I've been to Princeton. It's a beautiful place, and I'm really glad you're joining me.
I'm very glad to be joining you.
So what inspired you and Alexander to write this story? It's a very fun story. It's a walk through history, but what caused you to pull this out and work on this together?
Well, the fault lies entirely with Alexander Montague.
Okay.
As a member of the advisory council of Princeton's Department of Comparative Literature, he teased or nagged or prodded the department into putting on a course about copyright because, he said, copyright constrains and informs your entire field of studying literature and translation. And students should really go out into the world with at least some knowledge of this framework and its political, social, and cultural history. And muggins that I am, I said, well, all right then. And so we teamed up together, and I scurried off to the library and did some reading and talked a lot to Alex as well. And we put on a course for undergraduates under the same title called Who Owns This Sentence? A Cultural History of Copyright. And we had some enrollments, and we taught the course, and it went great. And I got more and more interested, so we taught it again. And then just before the pandemic, actually, Alex decided that he would leave his New York base and move his life and firm, lock, stock and barrel, to London. So we couldn't teach the course again as a joint act, and there was nothing left but to write the book.
I like it. That's a great story. So let's start out with the Greeks, because again, we're going back to antiquity as where you start your story out. How did the Greeks look at original work? How did they look at were there crimes, or I think you may make the case it's really an honor code?
Well, that's right. We look back to the Greeks to begin with, primarily in order to undermine the argument that everything that we think and believe and do about creative work is the downstream effect of our laws of copyright. That's a misunderstanding that's often put about, even to the extent that some of my professor colleagues tell students that it's because of copyright law that we have to have an honor code about not plagiarizing. And it's the reverse that's the case.
Sure.
That for thousands of years, there were clear understandings about what authors' rights were with respect to their work. They weren't property rights, but there were codes of conduct. And it's those codes of conduct that have ended up being wrapped into copyright law, but they precede it by a long way, and there's no need to have a copyright law for it to be understood that, for example, it's a dishonorable thing to do to take somebody else's work and publish it without their consent.
Sure.
And that's the main anecdote that we tell in the passages about Plato and the Greeks. Similarly, anxiety about when imitating or copying is dishonorable, and when it's honorable is something that the Greeks and the Romans worried about a lot. I mean, they had that anxiety, and there are lots of debates and arguments and some little polemics as well in the classical era about, when copying is a good thing and when you're going too far, and about the need to actually cite your sources in order not to be tantamount to a thief. So all of that doesn't underlie copyright. It precedes copyright. And if it hadn't been the case, then copyright would no doubt have a different shape from what it has nowadays.
Sure. And I think you used in the opening part of the book, you talk about Pliny the Elder was who published Plato's works. He was doing it to pass on the information, but nonetheless, to your point, he published work that truly wasn't his. So using that time, how was forgery looked at that time? Was there a crime at all in forging?
Yes, forging. I mean, there are two things. There's plagiarism and there's forgery. Forgery is writing something and passing it off as the work of someone else. And I think that's always been, if not a crime, certainly reprehensible behavior, something you're really not supposed to do, adorning yourself with the feathers of others.
Sure.
And you don't need a copyright law to make it just part of proper behavior not to do that. Plagiarism is a little different. Plagiarism is writing your own work, but incorporating into it the stuff that was written by somebody else before, and not owning up to it, not quoting your sources, not paying honor to your respect to your sources. And even Virgil was accused of that by some rather mean-minded critics of his own day. But the counter-argument to that was that Virgil was actually an honorable man and a genius for showing that he could rival his masters in the Greek world and aspire to the same standing as his predecessors had. So it wasn't, in the classical world, a settled thing, but an area of anxiety and dispute.
So in the investment business, we always joke that plagiarism is completely legal. And I quoted Charlie Munger earlier in the intro. And I the more I've studied Warren and Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, to your point, they often are actually quoting other people. It's just from the 1960s where that person didn't protect their original phrase, let's just call it. And we'll get into some of the ideas behind that. But so to your point, how this is practiced and how, how people are allowed to do this is just really, that's kind of the story of your book. You touched on this idea of copyrights versus patents and publishing. But originally, patents and copyrights were tied to each other. You give some of the history of what the original patents were. So could you teach our audience, where did the idea of a patent come from? Where was that geographically coming out of?
It comes out of Venice in the 15th century. Venice was a wealthy republic. It did a lot of trade. It supplied Europe with things from distant lands that couldn't then be made in Europe, silks and colored glass and things like that. And Venice reckoned that it could become, it would be even more interesting and wealth creating if it brought some of those craftsmen mostly from Aleppo and Alexandria and Damascus to come to settle in Venice and to produce their wonderful things there. And some of them are still there. I mean, colored glass is still made in the island of Murano. But they brought with them an idea that was practiced in the Ottoman Empire of the time, which is that a craftsman could request and obtain a monopoly on his trade for a fixed number of years. And so Venice adopted that as a way of attracting skilled labor from overseas. And it took the form of a privilege that they would be protected, and nobody else could perform their trade for 5 or 7 years usually. And that was a kind of guarantee to them of their security, at least initially, in the trade they were going to come and ply in these heathen lands. So that's the origin, and it just happened to coincide with the arrival in Venice of a skilled craftsman from Germany called Johann of Speyer, who'd been an apprentice of Gutenberg's, and he arrived with this radical new thing called a printing press. And Venice was very proud to have a printing press and gave Johann of Speyer this kind of monopoly, which was called a privilege. And so the privilege system grew up out of these two things: the Venice's decision to become a hub for the production of luxury goods with foreign craftsmen,
Sure.
and the protection of this radically new, transformative, skill, art, science, tech of the printing press. And so as the printing press spread around Europe, and it spread very fast in the second half of the 15th century, it took with it the Venetian idea of a privilege regime. And so wherever there was a printing press, whether it's Barcelona, Madrid, or London, or wherever, the guys who could actually design and make a printing press work were given the same kind of privilege protection, that nobody else would be allowed to do that within that jurisdiction. Usually for 7 years, because 7 years is the length of an apprenticeship. So at the end of the 7 years, their apprentices would become masters and then be able to compete with them.
Sure.
So that's how it starts, and that's why patent and copyright have this kind of distant common origin in the idea of a privilege regime for new things.
Sure. And I think I thought a lot about that because, these are, at the time, Venice was a principality in many ways. It wasn't it wasn't a country per se. It was a city-state. And that was beneficial to Venice. That wasn't necessarily beneficial to, say, Germany, because obviously the Gutenberg press was already in Germany. So it also brings up this idea of geographies doing something that might not be beneficial to other geographies, but yet are beneficial to them directly. And we'll get into that later as we talk about.
I mean, the comment on that, yes, Venice was very keen to keep it all to itself.
Correct.
And apprentices who escaped from Venice and went and set up printing presses in Padua or Verona were liable to severe punishment. In fact, in theory, the death penalty. It was a rivalrous way of doing it as well, as to keep the tech for itself.
Correct. This is kind of a prima facie question to ask, but how did royalties come into the industry of copyright?
Royalties, as you know them now, come much later, hundreds of years later.
Okay.
The term royalty really comes from the English experience when the English crown also used privileges not just to protect and foster printing and publishing, but it then spread it much wider to the rights to engage in all sorts of different trades.
Sure.
And under Elizabeth I in the 16th century, to a ridiculously wide variety of trades. For almost every kind of trade you could imagine, you had to get a privilege from the crown to be able to exercise it. Even to sell fish in Grimsby was a privileged thing.
Sure.
And so the fees that you paid in order to obtain this privilege, either up front or in stages, etc., they were paid to the crown. So they were called royalties.
Sure.
And they still are, even though they're not paid to the crown anymore.
Yeah.
But the idea of pro rata or staged payments or payments per item sold, that's a 20th century thing.
Gotcha. So let's go to that, because you talk a lot about the Stationers' Company and how it held this privilege after the monopolies were outlawed in England at that time. So can you teach our listeners how powerful these publishers were?
Yes, monopolies were outlawed in general in England in the first part of the 17th century, largely because Queen Elizabeth had made such atrociously excessive and outrageous use of them. They were just abolished at a stroke, except for new manufactures. The Stationers' Company was a cartel of printing publishing families in London. And that company or guild was given the overall privilege to publish books. And no book could be published if it wasn't published by one of the members of that cartel. So I think there were 80 of them at its peak. But anyway, it was a limited number. And you couldn't just print a book, and you couldn't get the privilege to print a book unless you were a member of that company and went through its particular routines and so forth.
Sure.
So it was both an organ of state control, because it had the responsibility for making sure that nothing published was contrary to the law or to the whims of the authorities. And at the same time, it was an extremely profitable little niche business, because they could charge basically what they liked for books, since the rule of the company was that no member of it would ever print a book that had been printed by one of their colleagues.
Okay.
There was kind of internal self-regulation, typical of a cartel or cabal, you might call it. And so they regarded the books that they printed as their property in perpetuity.
Sure.
A famous printing family called Tonson were the first printers of Shakespeare and went on printing Shakespeare. And so from their point of view, Shakespeare belonged to them. They had, under the aegis of the company, the privilege to print those books, because nobody else who was a member of the company could do so. And nobody who was not a member of the company had a privilege to print books. So, yes, they became wealthy capitalists of the early modern kind, and they served the entire English-speaking world from their bases in London, and drew handsome profits from it. They didn't rip off writers necessarily. They did pay writers for their manuscripts.
Sure.
But by and large, it was a one-off payment. Milton was paid £20 for Paradise Lost, for example.
Yeah.
Some hack writers could make almost a reasonable living out of writing a lot and frequently. But once they'd written their pamphlet or whatever and sold it to a printer member of the stationer's company, and they wrote it in the register of the stationer's book, well, that, what they called copy, which really meant text, or the contents of the book, then belonged to that printing family forever.
Sure. So the interesting part for the author, you mentioned they didn't get paid very well, but they actually had a lot more risk than anyone else. If they wrote something that was heretical against the king or queen, what could be their penalty versus the meaningless amount of money you just mentioned that they could make?
Oh, £20 wasn't meaningless for Milton. The value of money has changed a lot. I'm not quite sure what it would be equivalent to nowadays, but it's not a trivial sum.
But it wasn't going to cost him his life, was it?
It didn't cost Milton his life, but there were a number of firebrands who wrote things that were not approved of for one reason or another, political or religious, who suffered very severe penalties, not at the hands of the stationer's company, but at the hands of the law. One unfortunate loudmouth called William Prynne had his ears cut off as punishment. And Daniel Defoe, the author of Treasure Island, he was put in the stocks for 3 days and then imprisoned for having written something that was held to be blasphemous. Yeah. So, there were penalties, but and that was Defoe's argument, was that if he should be liable to punishment for what he wrote, then he should also own it in the other sense, that he should have the benefit of it for himself. Yeah. And that's the argument that took place at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century.
When I think, I'm a framework thinker by nature, and I think, as soon as I got to that part of the framework of this book, I thought, well, that should be the context which we analyze almost everything. Do you have potential liability? And therefore, because you have risk, quote unquote, in the liability, you have the ability to profit. And we have to match those together with each other. Otherwise, we're building, what some would either argue is an inequitable system, or a system that doesn't serve the public's good to advance, progress, and learn and educate, which we'll get more to. So you quote Solomon in the book. Solomon, who said, there's nothing new under the sun. That seemed like a very particular statement when you said it in the book, because it's a principle that you think a lot across the book on. Can you explain that?
Well, we bring that biblical quotation in because some of the arguments about the justification for property rights in created work derive from an 18th century bright idea of originality.
Okay.
The word originality gets into U.S. copyright law a lot later on, but the seed of it is there in the 18th century, which did a lot to change general public view of what an author, what a creator really was.
Sure.
Because prior to that, I mean, long-standing sort of received wisdom was that, genius comes from God, and all new ideas really belong to God and are just expressed through a man.
Sure.
Or else that new stuff wasn't a very good idea anyway, and that imitation of the ancients was the highest form of art.
Sure.
But in the latter part of the 18th century, a completely new way of thinking about this arose. Where does new stuff come from? And the answer given first by a guy called Young, was that actually it grows organically inside the individual, that it is an individual creation. And it's all part of the general drift of Western society towards a conception of the individual as the basic unit. But the question is anything actually original?
Yeah.
How can you assess the originality of something? What do you really mean by something new in the field of created work? And that's an argument that hasn't been settled yet. And we quote the biblical adage because, it keeps coming back.
Yeah.
And you find Mark Twain repeating it, and you find Jonathan Lethem repeating it, and many others too, who point out that all forms of writing and painting, they draw on long traditions. They are contributions to a pre-existing field of action, and it's absurd to think that anybody can create something entirely new, because if it was entirely new, you wouldn't even recognize what it was.
Correct.
So that's the tension that runs through all the discussions since the 18th century about what is an appropriate level of copyright protection and what is going against the interests of the arts themselves.
Hi, I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management and host of this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd like to invite you to check out SmeadCap.com. At our firm, we are stock market investors. We advise investors who fear stock market failure with a discipline that has proven success over long periods of time. Learn more about our funds at SmeadCap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. Yeah, to your point about the individual, that's a very Hayekian, kind of viewpoint in today's world. But at that time, that was, only beginning to bud in the Western world as an idea of liberty. How important was the Statute of Anne of 1710, and what did it create in this discussion? Well,
it's very important, and at the same time, a complete fizzle. It's very important because it uses words that have been repeated again and again in legislation and in discussion ever since. And that idea is that authors or owners should have limited protection of 14 or 28 years on the commercial exploitation of their new work. But it was a complete fizzle because basically the printers in the stationers' company took no notice of it. They said, okay, we have this statutory right now for 14 or 28 years, but we also have a common law right, a property right, and that we own these works after the expiry of this statutory protection, just like we own our horses and our houses and our fields. And it wasn't until near the end of the century, till a court case in 1774, which went all the way to the House of Lords, which was the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom at that time, that their lordships decided, well, no, actually, the Statute of Anne does mean what it says, and intellectual property, which they didn't call IP yet, but these rights were limited in time. So the effect of that decision in the House of just 250 years ago, plus a few weeks, and in February 1774 it was decided, what that did, and this is something that I hope we do make really clear in the book, and that many contemporary lawyers and commentators don't really grasp this. What that did was to create a vast public domain.
Sure.
Since the proportion of available books that have been published in the last 28 years is a small proportion of all the books you can read.
Sure.
Okay, and it meant that about 90% of the world's culture was available for free for any. You could reprint cheaper editions or selections or abridgments, and it protected only the writings of effectively young authors at the start or middle of their careers. And that does have something to do with the way in which a whole new generation of young writers sprang to the fore in the following decades. I mean, think of Byron and Victor Hugo and Balzac and so forth, and Goethe, because publishers' attention shifted from the public domain, which was the largest area, to that smaller section of new right that they could own the rights in for 14 or 28 years.
Yeah. When you're in this discussion, not long after you come to talk about the pharmaceutical businesses and the patents they have, and I actually walked away. In politics, you hear a lot about, in the United States, of drug companies and the prices they charge for their goods. But to your point on limited time, they do only have a limited time, which is, very unique to patents. So you look at the average drug or indication, as they call it, and there is usually anywhere from about a 10 to maybe max 20 years of life to that patent. Again, an idea of a limited time in your or my lifetime, for that matter.
Yeah.
But copyrights, as you lay out so wonderfully in this book, have an extension of time that only God can really understand, and only history can really explain in many respects. But you point out that math and science is not protected.
That's correct. And that is a really important thing. Science is not protected because it's always been held, and it's still held today, that the truth or facts belong to nobody.
Okay.
And what scientists find out are truths or facts. Mm-hmm. So the product of their work is in the public domain and always has been. There's a Latin tag from the Middle Ages that says, knowledge is a gift of God and therefore may not be sold.
Sure.
And that's actually still the basis of U.S. law today.
Sure.
You can't protect facts. Maths is a different matter. And the reason that we raise it, and it's a very important point in our view, is this. Copyright laws are supposed to protect creators. Well, what is the most creative use you can make of the human brain? Mathematics. I mean, as you ask any mathematician, it is a creative pursuit. Mm-hmm. New maths comes from nowhere but the individual mathematician.
Sure.
And yet it is not protected. The formulae in a the maths article published in a journal published by Elsevier, the article as a piece of text is protected, but the maths in it is not protected.
Sure.
This is to my mind, not exactly an anomaly, but it's like the thread that pulls down the whole structure. Sure. If the most creative use of the human mind is just so important that it can't be protected by copyright, then why everything else becomes a much less obvious question.
Sure. Yeah, because the idea of the work being protected versus its contents is that contradiction that you're getting at. And to your point, I think you address this multiple times in the book. You also talk about another great idea is, there is an issue of class. I think Louis XV, you mentioned, he looked and said, well, these are gentlemen creating these noble ideas, and therefore they're not publishers. And so he treated the gentleman very differently. Again, it was subjective to the people deciding the rules and laws. Just like you said, like in the case of the House of Lords, they decided a certain way, and then Parliament ultimately decided a different way in that time. And I think the to and fro of politics was very interesting. Can you explain the importance of Miller versus Taylor? Because this was another interesting story that then immediately had repercussions in England and Scotland to immediately follow that.
Well, the Miller versus Taylor case is the classic case of how after the promulgation of the Statute of Anne, things went on staying the same.
Sure.
It was a squabble between two Scottish printers settled in London over the republication of a very popular poetical work. The one of them said, I own that because although the Statute of Anne has run out, it's more than 28 years since its first edition, nonetheless, under common law, I own it. As against the other publisher said, no, you don't. I am free to reprint it because the statute's years of protection have run out. The judgment in that case went in favor of the publisher owner.
Sure.
Whether it's good law or bad, it's what prompted another Scottish printer, this guy Donaldson, to print the same book a couple of years later, but to engage in some extremely elegant and tricky legal maneuvering so as to get the case heard again, not in a court of sessions, not just in Edinburgh, but in the House of Lords. And that's where the big change came in 1774. So Miller versus Taylor was if you like, the thrash up to the real test case.
Sure. And then you point not long after that, people are watching this go on in copyright. Artists are obviously creating goods at the time, and they sit there completely unprotected. And so can you teach us what the first art to get protections were?
Yes, the first, I should say, non-alphabetic medium to get drawn within it was engraving. And that was the achievement of a single man, the artist William Hogarth, who, apart from being a painter, also resumed the ancient art of engraving on copper plates, of producing, and from a copper plate on which engraving has been done, you can produce 100 or 1,000, but probably not more, copies of the same image in black and white. And these became very popular for decoration, for putting on walls, because they're much cheaper than having somebody paint a painting for you. And his argument was that, books are the products of a printing press. Lithographic prints are the products of a printing press. The one is protected, and so the other should be too, because they are both protected. And it's a fairly specious argument. I mean, if you want to believe it, you believe it, and if not, it's easy to refute. They're very different kinds of presses, and they have very different kinds of distribution as well. But he won. I mean, he got it through the House of Commons, and it got royal assent. It's surprising. I mean, law is usually very, very slow, but in this case, it happened in a few months.
Wow.
We don't quite know who pulled which strings where, but Hogarth was a very well-known and much admired figure in the arts, and he got his way. So that's the first step. And so engravings got protected. I mean, initially, only engravings that were designed and engraved by the same person. So it really was Hogarth's law. It protected him. 30 years later, it was amended to protect all engravings. And so that's how maps and charts and logarithmic tables and so forth became copyrightable.
Gotcha. when I immediately started to think, I mean, if I'm going to draw a painting, I'm going to go out and engrave it to protect it, because even though my painting might not be protected, the engraving would be, and therefore I could sue based on the image, not necessarily the painting that I wanted to create. And so you get into, to your point, it's like regulatory capture. It's just you're doing it to protect yourself in another form.
That's exactly right. And a market sprang up amongst painters who, as painters at that time, had no control over the work other than the ability to sell it or to obtain a commission for making it. They started basically hiring engravers and paying them a fee to make engravings of their paintings so that images of them could be circulated, which would increase the market for their actual work, and at the same time give them control over the circulation of those images because they were copyrightable. And that's how little by little the fine arts got brought in to the field of copyright.
Yeah, and I think if I was going to give another theme for thinking about the regulatory repercussions, I would give it a theme of perverse incentives. In other words,
if you like,
paying an engraver to protect your art is a very perverse incentive, but it's what you did based in the structure that you sat under, to your point. You discuss Upton's Life of Washington versus, I think it was Sparks who edited the writings of George Washington in comparison. How does this story, can you kind of teach our audience about this story, and how does it show what I would argue is a terrible misstep towards business protection or rent seeking?
Well, that's a case that arose in the United States, and it arose in the next century, in the 19th century. And the question was this, could the publisher of the complete works of George Washington claim ownership of those texts when they were reused in a much shorter work intended for schools about the life of Washington?
Okay.
Washington himself has nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
And
he's nowhere to be found.
And
He's dead.
No money flows to the Washington estate out of it. So it is entirely a battle between the owners of these vague things called rights and the freedom of other people to use the actual texts of those works. And would you believe it, the publisher won. And effectively put the actual text of Washington's letters under but I mean, copyright didn't last as long then as it does now.
Sure.
And it's all been got over. But for a number of years, you could not publish books about Washington that included, or without permission or payment of a fee, that included significant extracts from all that there was. I mean, from everything that Washington ever wrote.
Sure. So the Reform Act of 1909 provided protection, like we're talking about. What was the term of that protection, and was this a fairly practical approach at that time when this Reform Act came about?
The Reform Act of 1909 is a milestone in many ways because it incorporated into American law some of the derivative rights that we now that are now part of copyright and that hadn't been before. But it did so at a time when the possibility of making derivative works was rapidly changing because the gramophone had been invented, the pianola had been invented, the movie industry had been invented, but the 1909 law doesn't actually give a ruling on any of those things. There were supplements to it in 1911 and 1919 that extended its scope. Okay. But the general idea of the 1909 law sets the term of copyright at 28 years, renewable once to 56.
Okay.
So again, post-mortem copyright doesn't arise in 20th century America, not till the very end of the late part of the century.
Sure.
So for the First World War, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the Second World War, international recognition is patchy and not consistent, and there's no such thing as post-mortem rights. And so it remains, well, if not a tiny issue, it's still a niche issue that concerns only a small part of the economy and a relatively small number of people.
Sure.
But yeah, the 1909 law also introduced something that was to have epochal consequences, which was in I believe it's paragraph 62 of a relatively short bill. It just says, for the purposes of this act, the word author shall include employer.
Hey, I want to give a big shout out to everyone who's been working so hard on the show. You know, we recently hit the top 10 investing podcasts on Apple Podcasts and even #1 in the business category in several countries. As you may know, this show is brought to you by Smead Capital Management. Smead Capital Management understands how frustrating and illogical the stock market can be. If you are searching for funds with a proven track record, give the Smead funds a look, or better yet, reach out at smeadcap.com. And don't forget to mention that you're a fan of the podcast. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. To say that parts of our regulatory framework and our laws are a circus act is actually an understatement.
Yes.
You tell the story of the lithography of two circus companies. What was the inherent issue in that situation, and why was copyright a big deal that had to be adjudicated?
Well, that happened a few years before the 1909 reform, and in fact, the 1909 reform refers back to that particular case.
Okay.
Yes, there were traveling circuses traveled around America and had printers print big posters, thousands of them, ranging in size from little leaflets to great billboards, and it was. They were coloured posters for the most part, and it was the biggest part of the whole business of the lithographing industry in the United States at that time. And one circus, called the Wallace Circus, ran out of posters when it was somewhere on tour in the Mideast, and contracted another printer, a different printer from the original one, to run off a few thousand more for its next publicity campaign.
Sure.
And the original printer of those designs, one of whose staff members had designed the things, sued them for copyright infringement, claimed that the copyright in those original posters lay with the company that produced them.
Sure.
And again, he won. And that, you might say, is the forerunner of that paragraph 62 in the 1909 Act, where it's formally established that
a company could be
the author is the company.
Yeah,
yeah, which is an abuse of the language. I mean, whatever you want to do to protect companies and their businesses, it's just not true to say that the employer of an artist is an artist.
Sure. Well, I think the other problem is, thinking back to Solomon, right? There's nothing new under the sun, and he talked a lot about his life. Well, we're not talking about your life, David. We're not talking about my life. We're talking about corporate lives, which are far longer than human lives, and therefore,
can be, yes. Sometimes they're a lot shorter.
Sometimes they can be. But by the way, particularly here in America, we find ways to create short-run companies in some cases. But I only point it out because I think the flip side has to be accounted for, which is the public good. And you discuss in the book what literacy rates did from like 1780 to 1880, and you directly point towards what had happened in the proliferation of what I'll call great works of the world and antiquity and those writings being published more often. Can you teach our listeners, what literacy did and therefore why these books in the public good were so effective?
The reasons for the rise in literacy is something I can't really comment on, except that it was the great tide of history.
Sure.
People learned to read. They learned to read partly because printed matter was becoming cheaper. It was becoming cheaper because of the mechanization of printing presses. It was becoming cheaper because of the invention of cheaper ways of making paper. But I think that this tide would have moved forward, perhaps more slowly, but it would have moved forward all the same. That was the drift of history in that modern period. So, you have to sort of think that, well, through the 19th century, most readers of new books were new readers. That's to say, they had learned to read, and not necessarily at school. And a country like America, but also Britain and France, they wanted more literate readers, literate citizens. Literate citizens could vote. And if they could vote, surely they ought to be able to read and educate themselves. And so there was a conjoining interest of promoting education and promoting books, and therefore also producing a regulatory framework in which it was possible and profitable for people to write books and newspapers. So it really is, it's the century of the triumph of the book and of print matter. By the end of the 19th century, pretty much all what you might call now developed countries were close to 100% literate.
Sure.
And literacy became increasingly a basic requirement for leading the life of a citizen. I mean, you had to fill in forms. It became more bureaucratic kind of society. So in that period, the beneficiaries of intellectual property rights were, well, for a large part, national heroes. They were great writers. They were prominent figures. They were also politicians. Many politicians were writers. Disraeli was a novelist. And the system, bit by bit, stumblingly and clumsily, but nonetheless sort of irresistibly, became internationalized, except for the United States, which stayed out of international arrangements for as long as it possibly could.
Yeah, now you talk about the history of the Red Cross. You talk about the history of what began as kind of patchwork agreements between France and Belgium, and then eventually, was born into what you refer to as the Berne Convention of 1886. Who was involved in that initially? How many countries now comprise that? And why was the United States so late to that game?
The United States, I'll begin with the last question. The United States
easier part.
Was late to that game for a very simple reason. It was a young country. It wanted to educate its growing immigrant population, and it wanted cheap books. And most of the books that it wanted cheap were actually written and published in Britain for the English language, but also in France and Germany and Italy.
Sure.
And it was much simpler for the United States to say, we can't be bothered with international. We haven't got anything to sell.
Yeah.
Yet, though in fact it did. There were many American writers who were immensely famous in Europe, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Fenimore Cooper. But the view of the United States was that only American citizens were entitled to copyright protection.
Sure.
And that it remained that way for a very long time. So back to Berne and the Red Cross. Well, I mentioned the Red Cross simply because it's the first truly multilateral international voluntary organization ever founded in the world.
Sure.
And it provided a model on which the Berne Convention was based. That's to say, signatories to the Red Cross simply obliged to committed themselves to obliging by a general set of rules without obliging any of those member states to change their own laws.
Sure.
And that was the model that Berne took. It was a voluntary convention coming together of countries that would that agreed to certain basic standards in the way they treated each other mutually, but they didn't have to change any domestic laws in order to sign the convention. So
Sure.
That's the relevance of the Red Cross, and the other relevance is why the Berne Convention was held in Switzerland. That's because Switzerland had already become the sort of recognized home of international cooperation and neutrality.
Yeah. You'd also pointed out that Russia joined that really late, like the United States did. And I at first when you said the Russian system of patronage was bizarre, and you explain that through the AK-47, obviously Kalashnikov's fame. I love that story, so I'd love you to share that. But I actually walked away agreeing with you that the way we state administrate these reminds me a lot more like Russia here in the United States than I would have assumed from the outset.
Please don't say Russia. The Kalashnikov story is a story of the Soviet Union.
Sure, yeah, of Soviet fame. Yeah.
Russia didn't join the Berne Convention prior to the revolution.
Sure.
For quite different reasons, but similar to those of America. The Russian upper classes were completely francophone, and they thought that their theatres would collapse if they had to pay royalties to French authors.
Sure.
They had some wonderful novelists, but they still mostly read novels from England and France, and they didn't want to pay for the privilege of doing what they'd been always doing. So they stayed aloof from Berne, but they were observers at the convention, but didn't sign up. The Soviet Union was a different kettle of fish, because the Soviet Union sort of abolished private property. Almost completely. It had an egalitarian view, but an immense respect for its writers and creators. And it developed quite elaborate systems for making them privileged members of Soviet society, and keeping things in proportion. I mean, if you were a writer who was approved of by the authorities in Soviet Russia and not totally idle, and became a member of the Writers' Union, you had a very comfortable standard of living in a way that, the beat poets didn't in America.
Yeah.
There was a system to support them. The Kalashnikov story is just very simple. That's really to do with patent law. And Kalashnikov, produced his engineering tinkering that produced this, an automatic rifle that became, the model of its kind, and sold hundreds of millions of copies. And of course, being the Soviet Union, Kalashnikov had no property right in his invention.
Sure.
But he got lots of kudos for it. He got promoted through the ranks. He was given a personal motor car. He was given medals, and perfectly satisfied with his lot as an inventor.
Sure.
And I liken this to many things that happen in supposedly non-Soviet regimes such as our own. The medals you get, the residences you get, the larger offices you get for having contributed to your company's profitability are really quite similar in structure to the ways in which the Soviet Union rewarded both its writers and its inventors.
Sure. When I thought a lot about actually the patent office, so when you send your patent in, they approve your patent or not, right? They don't have to accept your patent. If it is, it gets given a number. And if it's not, it's waiting to be approved. They call it patent pending, as we all know. And I thought about it as, does it make any sense for the state to administrate a yes or no system? That seems like, to your point on the Soviet system, you'd be picking winners and losers based on what you think's right, and you might not be right to make those decisions. So I actually asked myself the question, coming from the investment business perspective, should we actually have like a self-regulatory organization that just admits that it was entered into the register, and therefore it still can be adjudicated in courts, but the courts would decide the rights and wrongs rather than the patent office saying yes or no? Because at least it's more of an open market system that's not administered by the state, which a Soviet system is, always the state is first.
I don't know the answer to that. It's a little bit outside of my domain, but with patents, to know whether a patent is truly original and is worthy of protection in its own right, surely in most, if not all cases, that takes some very expert advice.
Exactly.
And I don't think that for me, it doesn't really much matter whether it's the Copyright Office or the Patent Office or a court. They're both, all of them would have to be listening to the guys who actually know about this stuff.
Correct. We'll come back to that. Yeah, we'll come back to that. But again,
copyright's quite different.
Yeah. So you talk about Leo Tolstoy. He dies, and he goes to give away his goods to, in effect, public. and the laws don't allow him to do it.
That's correct.
So even when we want things to go to the public domain and bless, I'll call it society, the laws, in his case, in Russia, weren't allowed to, to take it to a non-person. It couldn't just go to the public as a good.
What I think is it's true today here. You try making a will leaving your house to the public. I mean, you have to leave it to an institution, to a thing. But just to make it free and available, well, no, a copyright persists for 70 years after your death, and it has to belong to your natural heirs, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
You can't override that except by leaving it to some sort of institution or body or a university or whatever. But the public in general doesn't exist in the law.
Yeah, so a couple of things came to mind when I was in this section of the book. In some of our old branding, we originally started our company in Seattle, so we actually used a Pike Place Market sign. Well, to your point about, if when in doubt, you don't use it because there could be a problem by someone else, bringing claim to that good. We actually, we ended up having to reach out to the Pike Place Market Association, who claims right to that. Now they charge a nominal fee, so it wasn't that big of a deal.
Right.
But again, you're now in a situation where someone says, well, I have a claim to that. Now, whether that's true or not might cost you thousands of dollars
to find out. Yeah.
To find out. So you just pay the fee. It's like a toll. And ultimately, this idea of a royalty for the monarch was a tax, right? And we're in these royalty worlds where they are a tax on any decision, any idea that come with these images. So I thought a lot about that. Funny enough, in some of our current branding, we have some images that are in the common, in the public domain. Therefore, there's no rights to them. And there are some that we pay Getty Images or other parties like that. And if someone says, what's the difference between the two? I'd be like, well, I'm not going to tell you.
Well, and I mean, Getty Images and other similar image banks claim copyright in the photograph of the image.
Yeah.
And that's how they get away with it, that you have to pay Getty Images if you want to have the Mona Lisa on the cover of your new book.
Sure.
It's not because they own the Mona Lisa, they own that image of it.
Yeah.
It's it makes you want to laugh, actually.
Yeah, it's and I'll come back to a quote in a second, but Mark Twain's Prince and the Pauper, you wrote, it enters the public domain kind of at a certain point. Can you explain, like Tolstoy couldn't give his work to the public, how did the Prince and the Pauper not completely enter the public domain at once?
That's a different story, and it's about the mismatch between copyright protection terms in the United States and in other countries.
Sure.
And that was very annoying in the first half of the 20th century,
sure,
where American authors who only had at most 56 years protection here, but life plus 30 or life plus 50 when they were published in Britain or France. It was a complete muddle as to knowing what was in copyright and what was not. And the one thing I will say in favor of the monstrous 1976 Copyright Act of the US is it at least sorted that one out.
Sure. That makes sense. I have to say this quote because it's such a great line. You quoted Teddy Roosevelt in your book. He said, quote, "Our copyright laws are imperfect in definition, confused and inconsistent in expression. They omit provision for many articles which under modern reproductive processes are entitled to protection. They are difficult for the courts to interpret and impossible for the Copyright Office to administrate with satisfaction to the public," end quote. He said this in 1909, if I remember correctly from my notes. Mm-hmm. I find it interesting. First off, Teddy Roosevelt, we all know, is a trust buster nowadays. And I find that analogously bizarre for a trust buster to use those words and think of the regime and the world and the power structures we have today. Isn't that just as true as the day he said it as it is right now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, because I think so. I mean, I'm sitting here reading your book, and I'm like, gosh, the
yes,
framework is so bizarre, and it's very confusing. And it to his point, it's tough for the courts to adjudicate. I mean, the amount of time these trials take, and what it becomes is a game of who has the most money to go through the process, not who's right or wrong.
Well, that is an unfortunate consequence of, well, not so much of copyright law, but of the American legal system or judicial system, that undertaking civil action in the courts is very expensive. But that expense itself obviously benefits or tilts the balance in favor of those with lots of money against those with not lots of money. Unfortunately, I think that's true not just with copyright law, but with other kinds of regulations as well. But in the case of copyright law, it's only very rarely that an intellectual property covered by copyright is actually worth that sort of money.
Sure.
And as a result, the vast majority of litigation on copyright infringement is settled out of court.
Sure.
Which is fine, except that with settlements out of court and the details kept confidential, it leaves everybody else in just as much of a muddle as before as to what the boundaries are and what are the rules that we should be playing by.
Sure.
So just that as I'm sure you understand from life as well as from my book, that does have a tremendously chilling effect on all kinds of creative activities where you conform what you're doing to avoid any possibility of litigation, even if there's 99% chance that you're right.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast. You know, we work hard putting together this show, but we work even harder for our investors at Smead Capital Management. At Smead, we believe in disciplined investing, which is why the Smead funds have a proven track record of long-term outperformance. If you're an investor who fears stock market failure like I do and want to invest in wonderful companies to build wealth, we invite you to visit smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. When I think of it, to your point, because you don't know the settlements, you don't know what the market practice is, and therefore you're effectively augmenting the precedents that came prior. So I loved this. I didn't know this. This is almost, to your point, it's humorous, it's comical, it's unbelievable. If you try to sell something you don't have copyright of, what's your penalty?
I forgot. It's written in the word $2,500 maximum. Is that it? Yeah.
It's crazy, and I think there's a possible criminal penalty, but your only statutory fine is $2,500.
Yep.
So doesn't
Why
this
not?
caught? Yeah, you get perverse incentives where someone's going to put a sign on anything and say, pay me, because even if they're wrong, it's only $2,500.
That's right. That's one of the few things that is actually a criminal infringement of copyright is to slap a copyright notice on something that's not copyright and to make money from it. But because it's a criminal offence, not a civil offence, only the state can prosecute you.
Sure.
So does it lift its finger? No. My very learned informants on this matter in the Copyright Office, in fact, I give the figure that since the beginning of this century, only 14 cases of this cases of this type have ever been brought. 14.
Interesting.
And there are 250,000 books published every year.
Sure. So to play on that, I'm going to ask, since everyone has to talk about AI, you have to have it in your book. And that begets my next question. Will we see the finest examples of someone trying to copyright something they don't own via AI? Or maybe the inverse will actually come true, which is that AI will democratize the wealth of information that we have that people have been playing regulatory capture with for years, because ultimately they will have stolen it in a very unique and transformative way, via the algorithms they use. Do you see AI as just a bigger problem or possibly a savior to the public good?
At present, I do not think the latter is at all likely, that it's a savior of the public good, but I could be wrong. the current squabbles over whether AI companies should pay license fees for the use of the material on which they train their large language models seems to me not exactly a storm in a teacup, but it's a limited argument, and
Sure.
it could go either way because, after all, I can read all the books in the library.
Yep.
And if I were very clever, I could then write a big book that's just like some of them. That's what people do.
Yeah.
So if I'm allowed to do that without infringing copyright, why should a machine not do it? Why shouldn't the machine have the same right to read books and then to produce another one?
Sure.
Obviously, people might answer because it's a machine, or because inside the process that it uses, it has to make temporary copies. I think those are almost theological arguments, and I don't really mind which way round that is decided, because it probably will be decided fairly soon, since there are cases pending on that issue. I think a much more important and potentially quite sinister issue is, what is the copyright status of a work? Now we know it can be not just a text, it can be a picture, even a movie or a song, produced not by any human, but by a machine. To whom do the rights in that work, and as you now know, it's a big bundle of rights, to whom should that be ascribed? The Copyright Office only registers copyrights in the name of someone.
Sure.
Can it ascribe the rights in the name of a machine? Should we then be paying our royalty fees to a machine? No. Obviously, the only two options, as far as I can see, is this, that the copyright will be ascribed to the owner of the algorithm, right?
Okay.
Or it will be deemed that the product of an AI algorithm, whether it's a picture or a song or a novel, is in the public domain from the start.
Okay.
If the latter, which seems to me perfectly healthy in one sense, then we will be in this bizarre position where we can't know whether something that's out there has copyright protection or not.
Sure.
And copyright may crumble, as it were, because there'll be more and more of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't like that, but I don't like the opposite solution either at all, because the owners of the successful algorithms that power really successful AI generators will be very few indeed. It will be an even smaller number of large global corporations that own those algorithms, and so we'll end up with pretty much everything belonging to a handful of people.
Well, the only positive I can take out of the latter, to your point, is that we'll get into a world where the large owners of copyright will be at war with the large owners of AI technology.
They are.
And I thought, man, this could be real intergalactic warfare at its finest hour. I mean, that's a lot of power coming to clash, but in many respects, those are the powers that, we probably need to clash to beat each other down, to therefore raise the public in some cases. So I thought about the kind of these two warring factions, and actually it might be ultimately good for the public to see those two factions come to a head with each other.
Well, if they take each other to pieces, it might be there might be some opening there for an expansion of a genuine public domain that could be identified as such.
Correct.
And could be enjoyed and reused. But the problem is that the non-copyright works produced by AI are just going to be progressively watered down versions of what's already there. There isn't going to be anything new. By definition, there can't be anything new in the product of an AI algorithm.
Yeah. When we're talking about these groups, I mean, you talk. Can you just briefly explain Section 230? Because I think this is so important. I mean, I whenever I say to people, "Oh, Section 230," I have people look with glazed over eyes, say, "I don't even know what you're talking about." And I think to myself, this is maybe one of the most fundamental errors that we've made in the history of the public domain, looking back 200 years, plausibly, I would argue, on this subject. So, can you explain Section 230? And can you explain where you think that's got us because of Section 230?
Oh, well, it's perfectly clear where it's got us. It's got us Facebook and Instagram and X and all those things.
Sure.
That's what it's got us. Section 230, which is also incorporated into the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that comes a little bit later, is the ground rule for Internet service providers.
Okay.
It provides a safe haven for the owners of Internet services and makes them not liable for copyright infringement or indeed for any other offence that might be committed by their users who post text or images or whatever on their sites. In other words, it is a total innovation in the long history of publishing and censorship control and regulation, where where responsibility is not matched with a beneficial ownership.
Sure.
The ISPs make their living from the services they provide to people to post their stuff, but they are not liable for what those people post in a way that they would be if they were a newspaper or belonged to any earlier form of tech.
Sure.
From the 15th century to 1998. You could say it's a kind of liberation for the public interest because people can now post whatever they like, but they are liable for what they post.
Yeah.
And the ISP is not.
Sure.
So that's why Facebook prospers and all similar social media platforms and internet services.
When I thought
it's
I thought
extraordinary.
I thought a lot about where you started your book. You're the author. You write something. You could be quartered, and you could die, and someone else could make money. We're back right where we started. You could be held liable, and the publisher could make out like a king or queen on profits. So the idea, again, back to that framework of if the profit and the liability are not held by the same party, we're creating very perverse incentives in our societies.
Yes, that's partly why we wrote this book, that things are not as they should be. How they could be mended is a whole other question, and we want people to start talking about that, but on the basis of understanding how we got where we are and what the issues are. With respect to book publishing, it depends how you look at it. Yes, Alex and I signed a contract with the publisher in which we accept liability for anything unlawful that might arise in the book.
Yeah.
In practice, though, if there were to be a claim against us for copyright infringement or incitement to mass violence or whatever, the publisher would, in all cases I can imagine, stand by the author because the text necessarily has gone through pretty close legal reading, and we're all satisfied that there's nothing in it that is not legitimate. So we wouldn't be thrown to the wolves instantly.
Sure.
But in the end, when it comes to the crunch, the formal position is that, yes, we are liable. The publisher gets the profit and shares a bit of it with us through the form of royalties. So there is a certain degree of balancing. But the abstract position is crazy.
Yeah. When I think a lot of, and you touched on this, you talk about how important the Codex was in the history of publishing. Prior to that, we used papyrus or scroll as we think of it. And I was just at the Museum of the Bible, and they have the original Codex there at the Museum of the Bible, which is quite a sight to behold and an incredible story. And Andrew Pettigrew, who wrote the Book at War, who's written a lot about libraries, he pointed out that the book has a distinct advantage on the internet in that you always know where you stopped, right? Versus the papyrus, you'd have to scroll all the way down to where you were.
Put a piece of lead in it, yeah.
Correct. So I distinctly think in the copyright world, the book has a key advantage on even these, I'll call it these behemoth publishers, if you will. So I still think there are things that have to be grappled with there. Let me just ask you this. I'm God. I'm not, but I'll just theorize I'm God for a day. And I come to you and I say, hey, you're going to be king of the universe. What do you think is a fair limited use or limited time of use for a copyright of, say, your book? Like, if God was going to bequeath you a proper right, what do you think that would be if you had to set that rule as king or queen?
Oh, my lifetime, full stop.
Okay, so just as soon as you're dead, it's over.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I wouldn't have to make a complicated will about who's my executor and it's a great nuisance to have a literary estate to leave.
Sure.
No, I think that only restriction of copyright protection to lifetime of creator is the only way you could possibly justify these arguments about copyright serving an author's interest, because the author has no interest when he's dead.
Sure. When I thought a lot about this too. I mean, we pick stocks for a living, so we talk about stock pickers and their track record and their time serving investors. And when I die, my track record is over, and my ability to profit from my track record is over. And so I agree with you. That makes sense. That seems pretty obvious to me. But again, I just want to ask the question because, I mean, I think you talked about where Marilyn Monroe, she goes from being in the public domain, and then the Copyright Act of 1976 comes about, and she's back protected over again after that, even though she was in the public domain for a few years.
That's not the Marilyn Monroe story. The Marilyn Monroe story is about publicity rights.
That's right. Publicity rights. Yeah.
But yes. When the Copyright Term Extension Act was passed in the 1990s in the US, it's known as the Sonny Bono Act, or as
yes, that's right,
the Mickey Mouse Act. That's right. It was retroactive, so that works that had fallen into the public domain in the preceding 19.9 years went back into copyright for a greater or longer period. And that was something that many people felt to be really improper and also totally pointless, because if they'd fallen into the public domain, it's because their authors had deceased.
Sure.
So that it really affected the grandchildren of writers of the 1920s and 30s. It seemed just a crazy idea. Yeah. But it went through Congress, and that became the law.
Well, I think it's what a miserable way to go through your adulthood, sitting there suing people for libel and claims against an estate, when it's like your grandparents or your parents that's your life, is suing other people to protect an economic interest that, to your point, I don't think they deserve. I mean, that just seems like a miserable way to go through life. But then again, if you're their lawyer, they're the greatest customer in the history of the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So let's see.
But I mean, that touches on a much bigger question of whether laws of inheritance are justifiable or not. And I think we'll leave that out of today's discussion.
Yeah, we should.
But so given the laws of inheritance and the length of copyright, yes, there are small numbers of families whose principal activity is defending what they will see as their patrimony, but which is something created by a guy or a gal they probably never even knew.
Yeah, I totally agree. Some things we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about, I mean, you tie this directly to the U.S. Constitution, and you talked about some of the issues you have with what the Constitution says versus where law has gone and precedence has gone since then. I thought that was really wonderful. Next time in Guernsey, I'm going to register myself in Guernsey. Thank you for giving me that. Our readers should go read that section. It's a wonderful little picture of what insane things people plausibly will do here as we look forward to protect their rights. The other thing I would say to all of our listeners is you must go look at the Steamboat Willie images that are in the public domain, because obviously they now are. Not all forms, but certain forms are, I would say.
But you may still be infringing business trademark.
Correct.
If you use them in certain ways.
Correct. Yeah, no. And so to your point, you might not want to use it regardless, but supposedly it's in the public domain. I just wanted to ask you, there's all these interesting stories, and I loved all of this. I was just continue to go through my notes about, what postmortem meant at one time. I love the idea of apprenticeship in Venice, and that became apprenticeship times 2, times 3, times 4. What else do you think needs to be mentioned about your story? Is there a focal point that you think you touched that you had not expected to discuss in the book, or something that you think other books have missed tied to your work?
Yes, it's something that I came to realize in the course of writing the book. Mm-hmm. The copyright, or IP more generally, copyright especially, is really different from other forms of human wealth, because you can argue about who the land should belong to, and you can campaign for it to be more concentrated or more distributed in different models. You can argue about who should have access to education and housing and health. But you can't, with copyright, really think along those terms, because the design of copyright from the bottom up is to take money from the many and to give it to the few, on the assumption that if you weren't doing that, there'd be no reason for the thing to be. I mean, if there were more writers than readers, it would be in a different world. But it is inherently, essentially, a money pump that brings resources from the broad public to a small group. And when that small group were people like Charles Dickens or Mark Twain or Ernest Hemingway, nobody grumbled. It seemed perfectly fair. These were people you would want to honor and financially benefit. But since the 1976 U.S. law, and more importantly, even the Marrakesh Treaty of 1998, which makes it obligatory to abide by Berne rules in order to be a member of the World Trade Organization, it's become an enormous device for the transfer of resources from poor countries to rich countries, and within rich countries from the general public to a really rather small group of extremely prosperous corporations. And there's no way of reforming copyright, as far as I can see, such that it wouldn't do that. The only thing you can do with copyright is to reduce its scope, its range, or its term. But that's never been done. Every change to copyright law since 1710 to the day before yesterday has been to extend either its term in number of years, or its range in the sense of the different types of media that have copyright protection, or its scope in terms of the depth of those rights, of the bundle of rights that it constitutes. Turning it round is obviously going to be extremely awkward because, well, like with all laws, we've got used to it. I mean, everybody sort of copes, and lots of people have vested interests in it being this way because that's what they do. So I'm not particularly optimistic about ever getting out of this vice-like grip of copyright law. On the other hand, I really would like, people like yourself, but also publishers and lawyers and readers and cinema goers to start thinking whether this really is the way things ought to be, and how would you unscramble it into something slightly less outrageous?
When I think a lot about the information theory, the value of myself to society is the amount of time I save other people in their lives. And that is the wealth I accrue. But to the information theory's point, that's only ... during my lifetime, because that's the time that I save other people time. And so I completely agree with that. And I thought a lot about this as I was reading your book to ask the question, also in other properties, you usually pay things like property tax. Well, I can hold a copyright without paying a property tax, for example. And therefore, if the state is going to allow these quote unquote rights, they should be, treating it like all other property, which is it gets taxed, which is a whole nother idea, because then I might not want to hold the copyright if I can't pay the tax. So again, I think to your point, let's put it this way, I'm an optimist by nature, so I'm optimistic that people will see this. But to your point on, information and knowledge and beauty, that is what the public domain is missing in many cases, not in the sense of 20 years, but in the longer sense of, say, 100 years.
Yeah.
That's what we're really missing out on. I will say this to readers. This is a very humorous read. I know David touched at that. I know I touched at that. And it's a very fun history to discuss, a very unique history. For our audience, you should read Who Owns This Sentence, because like your own family, plausibly, not everything was planned and well thought out. Some of our current laws around intellectual property are in place because, like your family too, the mood was right and the person that was willing to pay the most got what they wanted. If you enjoyed this podcast, go to Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to A Book with Legs. Give us a review. Tell others about the books and great authors like David Bellos, that we have the opportunity to understand and study the world with and through. For our tribe, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeedcap.com. That's podcast@smeedcap.com. You can also send your suggestions to us on X. Our handle is @smeedcap. Thank you for joining us for A Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smeed Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smeed Capital Management and its products at smeedcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.